bike riders. This video was supposed to be about the Smoky Mountain Hog Rally in Tennessee, but my GoPro cameras, the batteries were dying on me, or I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, I didn't get any filming of the rally or the rides or any of that, but we did stop by the Wheels Through Time Motorcycle Museum in North Carolina. So I did some filming there, and the people that worked there, one of the gentlemen, he was nice enough to do some bike information and also started a few of them up. There are a lot of videos on YouTube about Wheels Through Time Museum, but there's one particular bike I was interested in. They found in a wall, and so that was pretty interesting, and he told us all about it. You might find that interesting. I hope you like it.
That's all.
So here we are, getting ready to take off from Lawrenceburg, going on to the Harley-Davidson Smoky Mountain Hog Rally. We got Jesse Seacat and Phil Tingle here. And it's a nice sunny day, but it's kind of cold.
Yep, another
Real sunny
excursion.
day.
Another excursion. Phil, what do you got anything to say about this? You're going to be on YouTube, by the way.
What do you got to say about this?
I hope it don't rain.
Yeah, well, no, that's right. We've got a hurricane. That hurricane's coming up, so we're gonna. Yeah.
That's all we know.
Don't rain.
I hope it don't rain.
It's gonna be fun on the way back. All right, well, let's get on with it.
Okay, let's get on.
Bye. Okay, now.
What you say there, buddy? Jesse, what's going on, buddy?
First time at the Dragon, and he led the way.
Enjoy yourself.
It's not as bad. It's not as bad as you think.
Did you enjoy yourself?
Yes, I want to do it again.
Okay.
And we're going to do it in the morning.
We're going to do it again tomorrow.
In the morning, yeah.
No.
So,
I don't think
Not
so.
in the morning, but
No,
tomorrow.
we're going
trying to
way
get David.
tomorrow.
Trying to get David. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there.
Now,
Quit running away.
Where we at right now?
So where are we going? Where are we going now?
we're going to Robbinsville, North Carolina.
Robbinsville, North Carolina. Yeah, we went out. We crossed the Tennessee North Carolina, right there on the tail, right? It
Yes.
said North Carolina. So now we're in North Carolina, and then we're going to go back to it tomorrow. And we'll be back in Tennessee, and we're headed to the rally.
We're headed over to Maggie Valley tomorrow to see the Wheels of Time motorcycles.
That's right, the Wheels of Time.
And after that, we're going to come right back up 129, head right back into Maryville.
Right, and I'm going to try to film some of that if I can get my GoPros to work. Still learning. So over and out. See you next time. Okay, what we have here is Phil in front of the Tree of Shame,
This here,
and there's David. David,
This is for Jesse's helmet.
this was part
Yeah.
of Jesse's flight.
there's pieces of me in there.
There's your helmet, Jesse. Before after you read.
See, let's get the.
Jesse,
There it is, Tree of
Is that your
Shame.
boot up there?
That's your boot?
Yeah, that might be my boot. I'm all scattered in this tree. The Tree of Shame is a tree where I guess if you wreck, your stuff goes on this tree, so we can all laugh at it.
I bet it wasn't too funny when it happened.
What?
I bet it wasn't too funny when it happened.
No,
Your shame.
no, I bet it wasn't. It's just, you can see it's pretty tall.
One tree I never hope to be on.
What?
This is one tree I hope to never be on.
No, yeah, no. No, I don't.
First time you done
Oh,
it,
I was scared to death.
you was like, yeah.
Talk it up. That was the first time. 2016.
As you can see, it's extremely loud here. It's
2016 was the first time I come on.
exhaust, lots of exhaust
First
noise.
time I bought a Harley.
Yeah, from high-powered bikes. Rockets with two wheels on it. Let's walk over here.
I've only been riding big bikes for 30 years.
Yeah. Let's walk. This is just one big motorcycle mess. That's all it
I've
is.
seen this parking lot completely full.
You seen them completely full?
Oh, you can't even get in here. Couldn't even get in here.
Why? Were they having some kind of rally? or
No,
something?
I just in the summertime
We
you
had
come up.
parked down there one time.
Yeah.
It's just
Then over the hill here is a real nice restaurant.
so you seen this parking lot full?
Yes.
Hold on, let me pan
Completely
over there.
full. Standing room only.
Be
Stand-
here about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning and it'd be packed.
Oh, that's on the weekend.
No, tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow's Thursday.
Yeah.
It's a rally
Tomorrow's
going
Thursday.
on.
I mean, it's packed here all the time, man. So
Huh.
when it's snowing around.
The weekend's worse. Saturdays.
Oh yeah, but
Okay.
you see
Well,
how many bikes was here when we got here?
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
Let me get you in the picture, Phil. Huh.
So it hasn't changed any.
So this is probably a good time of the year to come.
Yeah, when the leaves
About right
start
now.
turning, best time to come to see them.
I think the weather's
Fall-
perfect for
fall
this.
leaves, yeah.
Yeah, the weather's perfect for this. All right.
Son, I ain't got
Yep.
for that. I only got the-
Wheels through time. They got a little. They have a little creek in front of it. Look at that.
Here's your sign.
And there's David. There's Phil. And there's the beautiful backdrop. Okay, here we are at the Wheels Through Time. You can see me. There's the sign. And there's me. So I was here. So let's go inside. Here we are at the Wheels Through. What's Wheels?
Wheels Through Time, man.
Wheels Through Time. We finally made it here.
We're going back,
and-
way back in time.
yeah, and this is a
75 years.
this is a pretty cool museum.
Maybe 100
You
years.
just started.
Yeah.
Go all the way around. All in the
Oh.
back.
First thing right off the bat when you walk in, you see this.
You see a 32 Ford Model B dirt track racer.
Yeah, that's a neat car. Here we're at the
Quartermaster School.
Quartermaster Harley Davidson, mainly
World War II.
World War II motorcycles and stuff. Incredible.
You go out there, take care of it.
Pardon me?
Look at the tires on these things.
Yeah. Look, he said, look at the tires. Let's look at the tires.
Look at that one over there. Tractor.
Oh yeah.
Imagine when they got off the bike, they must have been
Yeah, look. Yeah, this is a Harley right here too.
Oh yeah. Here's Air Force.
Pretty neat. This is one of Evel Knievel's bikes right here.
Color me lucky.
Yeah. The man could break some bones. And here's another Evel Knievel bike. I don't know if he actually jumped this one, but that's one of his bikes. So here's the bike I was been talking about. They found in a wall that did 80 miles an hour. This is it.
How'd you hide a bike in a wall?
He did. He had to go. He went to the and this was before World War I, and this bike would do 80 miles an hour. It's amazing.
So, in 1967, a man was renovating an apartment building at 1520 North Paulina Street in Chicago, Illinois. And it's a group of row homes, all 5 in a row, and it's the very last one is 1520. Now he's measuring for flooring, and he notices that upstairs and downstairs of all the units are the same, except for the last one. So gets to the last one, upstairs, downstairs, different square footage, and that kind of confuses him. So he sees that the downstairs brick wall in the back has been kind of pushed forward a little bit. Takes a couple bricks out, and ends up seeing that there's something underneath the dust sheet back behind the wall. Now, he's no bike expert, but he pulls the whole wall down and finds the motorcycle behind it, and he has no clue what he's looking at. He's like, well, I have never heard of a Traub. It doesn't say Harley, it doesn't say Indian, so I'm at a loss. Now he asks around, who's the local bike expert in town? Who would know what this is? And he gets directed after a couple weeks to the Suzuki shop owner, whose name was Torillo Tachi. And he brings the bike to Tachi and he says, hey, what's the deal? I found this in a brick wall of my house, I got no clue. And so Tachi looks over and says, I've never heard of a Traub either. But he checks his encyclopedia of motorcycles. He goes, maybe it's European. Opens up the European catalog and not in there. Maybe it is American. Maybe I just missed this chapter. Opens it up. It's not in there. It's not in any available book at the time. There's no written record of this company existing prior to '67. So, 1915 Harley firing up over there. But he takes a look at it and he says, well, what can you tell me about this bike? What is it? What are some things you can try and get from your knowledge about this bike? And he says, well, it's all proprietary stuff. At the time, there were a lot of generic engines. A lot of companies were copying other designs. He goes, this is all proprietary stuff. The engine isn't a copycat. The frame is not a copycat of anything else at the time. It's all handmade stuff, which is really impressing Tachi at the time. So he says, you don't want to take this thing home, do you? It doesn't run. You had to load it on the truck. It's kind of heavy. Give you any bike on my showroom, so long as it's used, make it trained. So 350 Suzuki later, Torillo Tachi becomes the owner of this bike. The guy who was renovating the apartments goes home with a used 350 Suzuki. Now, Tachi, a lot like us, he wanted his collection to run. And so he fills the bottom end with the appropriate amount of oil and looks it over, and he goes to fire it up, and it is not happy. It does not run well. It is worn out, really. Now, from there, it just kind of sat in the window of his shop as an oddity and kind of a question and just a unique piece. And it gets traded between collectors a few more times, and we got it in the mid-90s. And when we got it, the 3 questions you would want to know about this bike still hadn't been answered, which is who built it, why was it put behind a brick wall, and why has no one ever heard of the Traub company ever before? So the first thing Dale did was not answer any of those questions. He went ahead, took the engine apart, and went to rebuild it. So totally rebuilt the engine, got it running good, and run good it does. It is fantastically engineered for the time. But after that, we started seeking out through the archives any mention of the name Traub in old motorcycle magazines, books, whatever. Now the first thing we found was a letter from 1907 to a popular motorcycle magazine called the Motorcycle Illustrated. And in it, a guy named Richard Trout from 749 North Paulina Street talks about how he built his own motorcycle from scratch. Now, he includes a photo even, and it's not the same bike, very clearly different bike. But it's quite a coincidence that, less than 10 years prior, a guy whose last name is one letter off, who lives half a block away, is making his own motorcycle. So we thought, well, look at the tank, kind of a swoopy B signature. Maybe they misread it as a T when they went to go put it into print. So we searched on some census records for a Richard Trout who lived at that address, and nothing came up. We then searched instead for a Richard Traub who lived at that address, and sure enough, on the 1910 census, Gottlieb Richard Traub lived at 749 North Paulina Street, working as an experimental machinist / motorcycle repairman. That's the guy. Now, being a motorcycle repairman in 1910, there were over 150 brands you had to work on. So I think he would have had a good first-hand look at all these manufacturers of what was breaking, what was making power, what tended to last, what wasn't wearing out. And I think that's why this bike is so advanced for the time. In 1915 or 16, the biggest bike you could get was an Emblem motorcycle made in Angola, New York, and it was 76 cubic inches. This bike is 80 cubic inches. A popular bike in 1916 would have been something like this Flying Merkel. The brakes on this bike, same brakes on the bike you had when you're 8 years old. You pedal backwards to stop. It's a coaster brake. The brakes on this bike, you have a drum and a band style brake. So you've got a spinning hub, it clamps on the inside, it clamps on the outside. That's twice as good as the next best style brake you could have had at the time. 3-speed transmission of his own design. Richard Traub was undoubtedly a genius. So why has no one still ever heard of this brand at the time? Well, when you look at Mr. Traub's life through the census, it sort of paints a little bit of a picture. Not a guy with a lot of money is the real reality of it. So his name is Gottlieb Richard Traub, and one thing I haven't figured out any sort of clever way to incorporate it into the story is that 749 North Paulina Street, where he's writing from in his first letter, 1520 North Paulina Street, where the bike was found, those are the same address. They actually just renumbered the streets in the the late 19 teens or so. And so we know that Richard Traub, for a large portion of his life, lived in a 2-story apartment building in the immigrant neighborhood in Chicago. When you look at the census of who he was living with, it's his 2 sisters who are seamstresses, his brother who's a foundry worker, and their mother who they work to take care of. Still, again, painting a further picture that not a lot of money happening in this household. So there are 3 parts on this bike that are not completely custom made. You've got the seat, the carburetor, and the magneto. Between those, the magneto is pre-World War I. The seat and the carburetor are mid-teens, so that gives us about a 1916 time frame for when this bike was actually built. At that point in time, I mentioned you had over 150 brands. By that point in time, most of them are starting to go out of business. The winners and the losers are being established of the motorcycle game. And so, if a German guy walks into your bank and says, hey, I've got a great idea for a motorcycle company. I don't have a lot of collateral or anything to put down towards it, but I've got some great ideas. World War I is going on, so it's probably a rough time to be someone named Gottlieb Traub in America at the time. And I really just think he was not able to get the company off the ground. Now, he was drafted into World War I in 1917, so maybe that put a halt on things as well. We're not entirely sure, but the reality of it is he probably just didn't have a lot of money to get this company up and running off the ground. Now, why brick it up? That's a really good question, but we reckon, I mentioned the first person to pull the bike from the wall and try to run it, the bike was worn out. So our best guess is that he probably maybe got back from World War I or before World War I, rode this machine as his very own personal motorcycle, just riding it. And the thing about these bikes in the 30s is that they're not worth very much. On the 1930 census, he lives at 1520 North Paulina Street. On the 1940 census, Mr. Traub has moved to a completely different part of Chicago. So sometime between 1930 and 1940, Mr. Traub moved, and that would have coincided with a low point in this bike's value. Best case, if you had an old worn-out motorcycle from the teens during the Great Depression, you would have turned it into a wood chipper or a tiller or an ice saw or whatever. Worst case, you would have thrown the whole thing on the scrap pile. And that was on bikes that you probably could have easily fixed. A 20-year-old bike today, low point in value, but they'll keep up with traffic. In 1935, if you have a 20-year-old bike, it doesn't have a front brake, it's going to take twice as much maintenance as the next closest thing, so not worth keeping unless it ran. Given that this thing wasn't very happy with running shape, I think Mr. Traub knew that if he let this go out into the world beyond his own care, it would have ended up on a scrap pile. And that's just the way it was. So I really do think he bricked this thing up in the hope that maybe one day it'd be a little more appreciated. And here you all are today. And I think he was right. It was a gamble, but I think he was right. So the world's rarest motorcycle, because one of none, found behind a brick wall in Chicago in '67.
How fast would it go?
You got about 80 miles an hour out of it on completely flat ground. He's got a 3-speed transmission of his own design.
That was ahead of
really
80 miles an hour back then was
that's flying.
way ahead of its time.
That is really flying for the time. The bike is really heavy duty. It's got a lot of torque, and the 3-speed really helps it use all that torque, because the bikes with all the torque, they'll punch it when you go, but they run out of breath really, really quickly.
Right.
But the 3-speed would have made this thing just a complete different game changer.
So if a manufacturer would have picked this up, it would have advanced.
You might be wearing a Harley Davidson or a Traub shirt instead of a Harley Davidson.
That's what I thought. It was that far ahead of its time.
It really was,
Wow.
Just an amazing design, really, that he was able to come up with. there isn't a part on the bike that isn't at least a little more advanced than your next closest competitor at the time. He probably cast this bike in the Thor factory, which was in Chicago. I mentioned his brother was a foundry worker. His brother was a foundry worker at the Thor factory. And he mentions in this first letter from 1907, built the bike between 7 and 11 p.m. and on weekends. Sundays specifically, which conveniently would have been the times that the Thor factory was empty. So if his brother had the key, they might have been sneaking in to cast the patterns he'd made for the engine casings. Because it's very well done. You know, this isn't an amateur operation. You would have had to have some sort of large-scale casting place to do this. You know, he wasn't just doing this in his short little shop he had behind his
Right.
house. We know, thanks to some fire insurance maps, he did have a little workshop behind the house in the teens and 20s.
And he was a machinist too, so
Yeah.
he knew tolerances.
He knew tolerances. He also knew.
And he was a bike mechanic on
He
top
would
of
have been
that.
knowing what was breaking, what was making power, and just combined the best of everything into one motorcycle. So you're looking at the ultimate teens motorcycle in addition to the
Yeah,
fact that
genius.
you know, it would be an interesting story if this bike was even just a pile of junk and what didn't run that well. But the fact that it is so advanced just takes it to another level.
Have you ever had a family member with that last name come in and
Quite a few, but we know thanks to the sense, it's a common German Jewish last name. It means grape in German. But we know thanks to the census that his direct line, none of his sisters had kids. Mr. Traub died in 1953, no children. His brother, no children. So there's unfortunately nobody directly connected to this bike to ask. You know, every now and again we'll get somebody like, oh, I had an uncle named Traub, and he mentioned that he made a motor, and nothing ever comes of it. We do get people who go like, wow, you know, I want to look into my family's history and see if I'm connected to this guy in any way, but you know, a few people have like, you know, they're like, oh, we're like third cousins, you know, so you see some stuff like that, but no one has ever come forward with any direct information. In fact, you know,
What about the tires? Those are the original tires? What, white
no,
rubber?
They're the original style tires.
Yeah.
of
They were
the
white
era.
back then. They didn't dye them black
Yeah, they were white at the time. You know, you have to add carbon to
make
get
them
more
black.
life out of the tire, but white rubber tires would have been a staple of the teens.
you said it was found behind a wall?
Behind a brick wall
Behind a
in Chicago
wall,
in
yeah.
1960. Bricked up by the man who made it, we reckon, probably in the mid-30s.
That's amazing.
Not another one like it. You know, there's a lot of bikes in. We call this one the world's rarest. There's a lot of bikes in here where there's only one made, there's only one left. We call this the one of none motorcycle because, you know, there's no written record of this bike prior to it being found in '67.
It was so advanced for its time. 80 miles an hour.
The other way you can be sure of what the letter is in a foundry, that bead would have been picked out.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Type block.
They wouldn't have mistook a B for a P.
Yeah.
Because you pick up those letters and they put them in the pattern.
Yep.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
you end up-
so you can be certain
We got
whatever
it
they
from,
put
so
in there.
the guy who
That-
collected
yeah,
it
okay.
originally, you know, Turillo Tachi was the Suzuki shop. He was the guy who actually found the bike behind the wall was no expert. He brings it down to the local expert bike collector who owned a Suzuki dealership, trades him a 350 Suzuki for the bike, which, you know, at the time, probably a pretty good trade. Like, this thing, not running, no parts, just kind of a mystery. It's a gamble to buy, and nobody really cared about these bikes in the 60s. Because, I mean, they don't go, you know, they don't keep up with traffic. But then it ends up actually Bud Eakins, who was Steve McQueen's stuntman, bought the bike. So he was another bike collector. He ends up in Chicago doing some stunts for the Blues Brothers. And when he's in town, he goes and talks shop with the other bike collector in the town, Turillo Tachi, and he goes, "Whoa, that thing's cool. Let me take that home to California. I want that in my collection." He sells it to him at the right price. I think from Bud, it goes to a collector named Richard Morris. We got it from Richard Morris in like the mid-90s.
Wow. That's
Just
cool.
traded hands between collectors. That's the sense Tachi had it.
That's really neat.
It's a wild story. Not another thing like it.
No.
That's just sweet sound.
So during World War II, they made almost 80,000 of a bike called the WLA. WLA is pretty much just a typical Harley. It's a 45, so like every bike in that exhibit behind y'all over there, with more green paint, less chrome, and less fender. Now that bike went everywhere the American military did, primarily escorting the columns of tanks and troops. However, anyone who rides a Harley knows how hot the back cylinder can get. So at 5 miles an hour escorting tanks in the Sahara Desert in the North Africa campaign, the rear cylinder would overheat, get too hot, seize the motor. So what they did, the military requested 1,000 bikes from Harley, 1,000 bikes from Indian, that was supposed to solve all the problems they were having. Because in addition to the rear cylinder getting too hot, go figure, it's hard to ride a hardtail, hand shift, foot clutch bike off-road in the sand. So they requested a bike that was going to have hand clutch, foot shift, shaft drive, rear suspension, and most importantly, opposing cylinders for equal cooling. Now, neither company, Harley or Indian, had made anything like that at all to that point, so it's kind of a tall order. Indian, they wanted to stick with what they knew, which were V-twin engines. So they took the V-twin, turned it this way, spaced them out further so they would clear the tank, and you could, the closest analog today would be like a Moto Guzzi style engine with the cylinders up and out here. Now they did that on them by themselves from scratch, but they took a lot of R&D to make that design work. Harley, for their part of it, they said, well, we don't want to do any of that R&D. So the quickest way to do R&D, or do no R&D, is to rip off someone else's design. All's fair in love and war, and that includes patent infringement. This is a nut-for-bolt rip-off of the 1938 BMW, German-made, R71. So, you know, it's made in America, it's dressed up as a Harley. You've got fenders, fork, carburetors, generator, tank, wheels, etc. But as far as the engine goes, the frame goes, the shaft drive, the rear suspension, all of that totally copycatted straight from BMW.
The very people we were fighting.
Exactly. What are they going to do? Sue us or start a war about it? You never know. But, you know, this is a pretty interesting bike. They made 1,000 of them, or 1,011 if you want to get real specific with it. By the time they got them done, no more war in North Africa. So what they ended up doing is, you know, aside from the few hundred that they sent to training camps to teach guys how to ride the German control layout, hand clutch, foot shift, they sold them off as surplus. So at the end of the war, you know, there were tons of surplus bikes available, but the cheapest one would have been the German-looking motorcycle, because nobody wanted the German-looking bikes in America after World War II. So you could take this thing home, add the skirted civilian fenders rather than the flat-top military ones. You could add a little bit of chrome here and there, and if you'd run out of money by that point, which is what happened to this guy, you could brush on a paint job rather than having it professionally done. So now on you guys' side of the tank, the strips on the tank are still here, but on this side, they've fallen off, revealing OD green military paint still underneath this right there. So these are called the XA. They're real creative with the names. It stands for Experimental Army. And they made 1,000 of them, and none of them ever saw any sort of combat. So they were mostly sold off as surplus at the end of the war. You could pick it up cheap, and you had a pretty well-engineered bike. It's German designed, it's made in America. It's kind of a hard combo to beat. Made about the same horsepower, but...
So the surplus ones, they changed out the wheels from the disc?
Well, they only made a few of them that had solid wheels in the first place. You know, they all were dressed up for different roles. Like, had this particular one been in service, I can tell you it would have been carrying a radio, because this one has these special anti-radio interference spark plug caps on it. So they all had a few different roles, but that one has got, the one over there in the military exhibit's got the solid disc wheels, which are real heavy, and it's got that auxiliary shock absorber on the fork to accommodate that. So some came with the wheels, some came with the regular spoke wheels. Just different setups depending on what they were going to use them for, but never actually used any of them.
Huh.
Indian, they only got through about 400 or so before the contract was canceled, because, you know, they had to do R&D. It took them a longer amount of time to get those bikes out the door. So Harley, they didn't do much R&D. And out of the 1,000 or so made, this is 007, number 7.
Wow.
Were there any of the Indians?
We've got one in the very back of the military exhibits, the Desert Tan bike against the wall, up on the platform. but very unique. Bike runs good, makes about the same horsepower as the WLA, runs 100 degrees cooler if you let it get fully up to temp.
Yeah, I was wondering if,
That's
it,
neat.
if it solved the heat.
Oh, it did. You know, the German bikes keep a marching pace in the desert. The Harley, it's just not the place for a Harley. You got to have open road for a Harley Davidson. Even today, a lot of the modern Harleys have the feature, if you twist the throttle all the way forward, the rear cylinder shuts off to keep you from overheating in traffic, because it's a known thing.
Yeah.
Yep. I have a deluxe.
That you got that feature? Oh,
It just
you're acquainted.
dies.
Yeah.